It was precisely because of this democratization and expansion of the art world undertaken by the Lingnan School founders that Chao Shao-an, a largely self-trained student of humble origins in southern China, was able to secure a spot in Gao Qifeng's training academy and quickly began participating in national and international arts venues. Because of the major social upheavals of the 1920s through 1940s, relatively little early work by Chao Shao-an survives. However, a comparison of flower compositions by Gao Qifeng and Chao Shao-an from the early 1930s reveals the manner in which Zhao incorporated Gao's masterful control of layers of wet pigment to create texture and shading effects in the petals and bark of the composition. By the time of this painting, Chao Shao-an had already achieved his first taste of success the previous year at the young age of 24, when a work of his was selected for the first national art exhibition organized by the Ministry of Education in Shanghai. In keeping with the spirit of travel of the Lingnan School, this selection kicked off 2 decades of travel and exhibition across Asia and Europe. He won his first international medal only 1 year later in 1930, when he received a gold medal at the International Exposition in Brussels. His work would go on to be exhibited internationally in shows throughout the 1930s as part of the Chinese nationalist government's efforts to promote Chinese art abroad. Unfortunately, much of Chao Shao-an's travel and exhibition in the 1930s and 1940s was driven by warfare and tragedy. In 1933, Gao Qifeng died unexpectedly while preparing for a joint Sino-German art exhibition in Shanghai. Likewise, Gao Jianfu began to recede from the national art reform discourse as Japanese hostilities towards China began to increase in the late 1930s, and his overtly touted artistic influences from abroad became less acceptable on the mainland. Chao Shao-an, having established his own Lingnan Art School and Studio, grew in importance as a representative of the Lingnan School style. He began taking up teaching appointments at art institutes in Guangzhou, ultimately becoming the chair of the Chinese painting department at the Guangzhou Municipal Art School in 1937. However, with the onset of the Sino-Japanese War in 1937, Chao Shao-an spent the next decade fleeing the advance of the Japanese armies, all the while exhibiting and donating his artwork to raise funds for the war effort. He spent his first 3 years as a refugee in British Hong Kong before it too fell to the Japanese. The artist then escaped through Macau to the mainland, passing through Guilin in Guangxi province, before making it to the wartime capital of Free China in Chongqing, Sichuan province. There, Chao Shao-an painted the magnificent scenery of the province from nature, and some of the most important Chinese artists of the first half of the 20th century took note, including Xu Beihong, the master of the European academic painting traditions, and Qi Baishi, a major ink painter that would remain a longtime friend. At the end of World War II, Chao Shao-an briefly returned to Guangzhou to teach at Guangzhou University. However, as the war between political factions in mainland China reached its zenith, Chao Shao-an took the opportunity to emigrate to Hong Kong and re-establish the Lingnan Art Studio in his residence in 1948. Although he had already witnessed tremendous changes in the first 4 decades of his life, the final 5 decades would see him develop his mature artistic style, travel the world multiple times over, and train many generations of disciples in the Lingnan School style. Although no longer in use, a recreation of Chao Shao-an's studio exists in a pavilion dedicated to the artist at the Hong Kong Heritage Museum. Although a capable artist in all major categories of traditional Chinese painting subject matter, including landscapes and human figures, it was from this studio that Chao Shao-an set himself apart from the founders of the Lingnan School and achieved true mastery of the genre of bird and flower painting. Monumental works such as White Peacock and Red Persimmon, which is over 6 feet in length, show Chao Shao-an's tremendous technical precision built upon the broad foundation of sources taught by the Lingnan School. In the leaves and fruit of the persimmon tree, we see the deft adaptation of traditional ink painting techniques in which successive layers of wet pigment and ink are laid down while previous layers are still drying. In this wet-on-wet application, the spread of new layers of wetting is resisted by the boundary edges of the previous layer. Quick and challenging to control under standard circumstances, Chao Shao-an's mastery of this technique allowed him to control the pigment to shade the fruit, branches, and leaves of the tree, giving it a realistic sense of volume, as we saw in his earlier work. Likewise, he utilizes a much drier application of pigment in the body and feathers of the peacock to generate dark and light contrasts that also give a sense of realistic volume to the bird. This command of traditional brushwork with international methods for generating realism is an apex of the Lingnan School ideal of sketching nature. The mastery demonstrated in these monumental works made Chao Shao-an rightfully famous within the international arts community during the 1950s and 1960s. He first traveled to Japan in 1951 to exhibit large works of this style in an exhibition sponsored by the Asahi Shimbun newspaper, which also celebrated the connections between the Lingnan School and the early Japanese art reform movements. He continued on in the 1950s to show his work in Malaysia, Singapore, and across Europe, most notably in Rome in 1954, during which he took time to travel around Italy, as well as to host multiple exhibitions in London, including at the famous Marlborough Art Gallery. In 1960, Chao Shao-an began the next major phase of the spread of his Lingnan School style through a year-long stay in the United States, during which he traveled, exhibited, and lectured at major universities and art institutions from coast to coast. His stops included Harvard University, where he lectured on Chinese ink painting and the global art world at the invitation of the noted Chinese economic historian Yang Liansheng. He went on to show his work and demonstrate at Ohio State University, the University of Chicago, the University of Illinois, the University of California at Berkeley, and UCLA, amongst other institutions. All the while, he held one-man shows at the universities and neighboring galleries, including most importantly, the M.H. DeYoung Memorial Museum in San Francisco. Chao Shao-an took advantage of his time in the San Francisco Bay Area to continue creating monumental works in his mature Lingnan style. He was particularly moved by the landscape of China Cove in Carmel, California. There, he sketched several views of the cove, as well as Pigeon Point Lighthouse in nearby Pescadero, California. The striking ink paintings created from his nature sketches show an increasing emphasis on capturing the momentary passage of time, a subject that had gradually appeared as he began traveling heavily in the 1950s, and a topic that he would focus on in the final decades of his life. Here, particularly in the Pigeon Point Lighthouse composition, we see Chao Shao-an's increasing preference for capturing the environment during specific moments of transition over the course of a day, particularly the vibrant California sunsets, as well as a recurring motif of migratory birds in motion that appear in a variety of his landscapes from this period. Even after Chao Shao-an's return to Hong Kong, his work continued to be exhibited heavily in the United States, Canada, and Europe in the 1960s and 70s. Throughout these decades of travel and exhibition, Chao Shao-an continued to be based in Hong Kong, producing personal works out of his charming cicada studio. Chao Shao-an was fond of the cicada throughout his life, as it was an insect that attached itself to branches high above the fray of everyday life, subsisting on the pure morning dew. As Chao Shao-an grew into his late 70s and 80s, we see a transition occur in his life and artwork as he too gradually calmed the fray of a momentous life. After having spread the Lingnan School style around the globe over the course of the preceding 5 decades, Chao Shao-an returned to his roots in the paintings produced during the final decades of his life. Although we have seen that Chao Shao-an's work had always been grounded in Chinese ink painting traditions, like Gao Qifeng had expressed, his late period marked a return to, quote, everything that is artistically good in traditional painting, the brushwork, the emotion expressed, the poetic meaning. Due to his health and changing tastes, Chao Shao-an's ink paintings began to focus almost exclusively on the more intimate format of the album leaf painting, and his subject matter shifted almost exclusively to emphasize traditional Chinese auspicious themes. Fruits such as the pomegranates and persimmons present in our exhibition were created as symbols of fertility and prosperity due to their many seeds in the case of the pomegranate and the phonetic associations of the word persimmon in Chinese with other blessings of good fortune. Beyond the intimate depictions of traditional subject matter in these paintings, Chao Shao-an, always a master of tightly controlled brush and water techniques, began to free his brushwork somewhat in his later years. Compositions such as this bamboo and insect on display in our main floor corridor offer a remarkable contrast between the tightly controlled color techniques used to modelize the bug that devours the bamboo with the powerful and uninhibited brushwork of the bamboo itself. Through a lifetime of technical practice, Chao Shao-an began to forcefully express the spirit of his brushwork in these later years, channeling a blend of ideals from both the sketching nature and sketching ideas traditions. As we saw with his works produced in California, almost every piece from his later period that we have on display for this exhibition places subtle emphasis on the small, transitory passage of time in the natural world. To return to our birds on a branch, we see a small, intimate moment capturing the passage of the seasons from winter to spring as the sparrows are caught in one of the last snowfalls of the early spring, as revealed by the buds preparing to blossom on the branch. Beyond the subjects of these pieces, many other aspects of the works also reveal the passage of time through the artist's reflections back on his long life. In our persimmons, we see the inclusion of a unique seal stamp. Such seals represent one dimension of artistic exchange. They were often carved by artists and gifted as signs of respect. Chao Shao-an utilized a variety of seals from some of the most famous Chinese artists of the 20th century. But here, even at the age of 81, he continued to use a seal by his colleague Feng Kong-ho from 1960 that captured the international nature of his career. It reads, quote, "I have left footprints across Britain, the US, France, Italy, Switzerland, Germany, Japan, India, and the Philippines." Additionally, beyond painting, throughout his career, Chao Shao-an had practiced all of the so-called 4 accomplishments and 3 perfections of traditional Chinese scholar artists. These referred to the primary art forms cultivated by elite society that also included poetry, calligraphy, music, and games of strategy. Our exhibition also contains a poem that exhibits Chao Shao-an's mastery in this area. The piece, composed during Chao Shao-an's time abroad in Venice, also shows the beginning of the themes of the passage of time during the artist's travels in the 1950s and 1960s in its focus on the passing of an evening. Yet the calligraphy itself was written over 3 decades later as Chao Shao-an reflected on his past experiences in 1986. The same poem also appears inscribed on other intimate compositions from this late period. Chao Shao-an's work remained powerful as his themes and artistic emphasis shifted late in life. Yet I'd like to conclude my thoughts here with some reflections, highlighting one aspect of Chao Shao-an's long life and career that never changed, and which I consider to be one of his most important legacies, that of his role as an instructor. Chao Shao-an first began teaching in 1927 and continued teaching until he passed away in 1998. That is 71 years of instruction, both intermittently in times of trauma and full-time in decades of peace. Whereas the founders of the Lingnan School transformed Chinese ink painting through their reforms to artistic practice and democratization of artistic discourse, Chao Shao-an revolutionized the international world's understanding of the living traditions of Chinese ink painting through decades of demonstration, instruction, and travel. The album leaves displayed in our exhibition were largely created in the context of studio demonstrations for the artist's students. Chao Shao-an, Moments Between Worlds, as an exhibition, continues Chao Shao-an's legacy of instruction in these pieces, as they bring Chinese ink painting in the Lingnan School to a new generation of students at Notre Dame and the broader Notre Dame community. With that, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to all of the wonderful family members of Chao Shao-an that I had the pleasure of working with, and thank them for their generous loan of artworks to this exhibition. I would also like to thank Michelle Hooks, Christine Cox, and the entire team at the Leo Institute for Asia and Asian Studies for their tireless efforts to bring Asian art and culture to the Notre Dame campus. I would also like to thank Catherine Lyon and the Notre Dame Global Gateway for introducing us to the artist family, hosting us during our visit to Hong Kong to select artwork for the exhibition, and for facilitating this exhibition as a whole. And last but not least, I'll conclude by thanking Joe Bescher and the entire team at the Snite Museum of Art for their patience and for making this exhibition a success. Thank you all for listening.